I'll read the skill files first, then generate the 700-line TTS script. Good, both documents already in context, the story content and the prompt instructions. I have everything I need. Now I'll write the 700-line recap script. He spent 56 years locked in a dark room, eating moldy bread, watching everyone he loved die, and the moment he finally solved it, he died too. But death, it turns out, wasn't the end of Isaac Gerta's story, it was just the reset button. Let's back up to where this whole tragedy started, because Isaac was not always the man rotting alone in a basement cell. Before everything collapsed, he was the golden child of House Gerta, a noble family stationed in the frozen north known for producing powerful mages, and Isaac, the eldest son, was supposed to be the greatest of them all. Maids lined the hallways with gifts on the day his recommendation to the Royal Academy came through. Workers shouted his name like he was already a legend. Even the family's nanny baked every single one of his favorite treats just to celebrate. His younger brother Jonas, barely old enough to hold an instrument properly, played music for him with the biggest smile in the world, like nothing bad could ever happen. Everyone called Isaac a genius, and for a while it seemed like they were right. Then the fever came. At first the family told themselves it was just an illness, something that would pass with time and rest. 3 months went by and it didn't pass. A scholar from the magic tower finally came to examine Isaac, and what he discovered changed everything. Isaac's mana wasn't just unusual, it was violent. It moved too fast, too chaotically, like a thunderstorm crammed inside a child's ribcage. And whenever that wild mana collided with the mana in the air around him, it detonated. People started getting injured near him, then servants started dying. The entire mansion began living in constant fear of the next explosion, never knowing when it would come or who it would hit. Then one afternoon Isaac's mana erupted without warning, and when the smoke cleared, Jonas was on the floor. His right arm was gone. Isaac made his decision the same day. At only 15 years old he walked to his father and begged not for a cure, not for help. He begged to be locked away somewhere no one could reach him. And his father, heartbroken and out of options, gave him what he asked for. From that day forward, Isaac's room became a prison of his own choosing. The years that followed were quiet in the worst possible way. His loyal aide Lucas stayed at his side longer than anyone, until mana slowly claimed Lucas's life too. His family aged without him, his father died. His mother spent her life wandering the continent, desperately searching for a cure she'd never find. And Isaac remained in the dark, decade after decade, surviving on stale bread and the faint hope that research might one day save him. Then came the day Isaac turned 71. Jonas, his one-armed brother, knocked on his door. They talked for hours through the wood between them, two brothers trying to rebuild a lifetime of missed moments with nothing but words and time. But Jonas had not come just to reminisce. He had come to deliver news a war had broken out, and a gate from another world had torn open, pouring something monstrous into their reality. Isaac, shaken by concern, finally opened the door, and found blood spreading across the floor beneath his brother's feet. Jonas had already been stabbed before he arrived. He had spent his last breath walking to that door, talking to his brother one final time. After burying Jonas in the spring thaw, Isaac went back to his research. Something in him had shifted, hardened maybe, or simply emptied out. And then at last a small flame appeared in his palm. He had solved it. He had actually solved the curse that ruined his entire life. And it was too late. He closed his eyes, full of regret, and died. That should have been the end. But then he heard a voice. A familiar voice calling his name, and it was Hans. Hans, who had been dead for decades. Isaac refused to believe his own ears as his eyes dragged themselves open. And the first thing he saw was a young boy pulling a window open beside his bed, letting cool morning air into a room Isaac did not recognize, because it was his childhood room, exactly as it had been over 50 years ago. Hans stood there, 12 years old, concerned that Isaac looked pale and drenched in sweat, completely unaware that the boy sitting up in that bed had just lived an entire lifetime. Isaac sat still, convinced for a moment that he was dreaming, or that his dying mind was playing tricks on him. Then he looked out the window and saw Jonas. Young Jonas, both arms intact, laughing, chasing the maids around the courtyard. Something cracked open in Isaac's chest, and for the first time in a very long time he smiled. He was back. He didn't know how, and he didn't fully believe it yet, but he was back in his 12-year-old body, decades before any of it had gone wrong, and that meant one thing above everything else. He could change it. But the first test of this second chance came almost immediately, and it wasn't a monster or a mage or a villain. It was Hans, holding a tray and wearing the most genuinely caring expression that Isaac had not seen on any living face in half a century. A flash of memory hit him hard. He remembered overhearing maids complaining about his condition once, about living in fear of the next explosion, about cleaning up the damage he left behind. And he remembered what came after that, how Hans had moved to scold them, and how Isaac had stopped him, because the maids weren't wrong. He remembered the bandage wrapped around Hans's head that day, put there by one of Isaac's own mana explosions. Hans had knelt in front of him then, and told him everything would be fine, told him it was just a rough patch, that it would pass. Hans spoke with such brightness about a future that he would never live to see, because that brightness cost Hans his life not long after. So standing in his childhood room, with Hans right there, alive and smiling, Isaac made a choice that tore something out of him. He told Hans coldly and clearly to leave. Hans laughed it off at first, assuming it was a joke. Isaac made sure there was no room for that assumption. Hans went quiet, then slowly walked toward the door. Before he crossed the threshold, he paused and said, told Isaac that it was okay to let people in sometimes, that he didn't have to carry everything alone. And here's the thing, Isaac knew Hans had never said those words the first time around. He slapped himself hard across the face to check he was dreaming. The sting confirmed it. This was real. Whatever had brought him back, however this had happened, he was truly undeniably back in the past. And now the real question wasn't what had brought him here. It was what he was going to do differently this time. The answer for Isaac was already fully formed. He wasn't going to waste a single day grieving or adjusting or processing the miracle. He had one goal: stop the man explosions before they destroyed anyone else. And he already knew exactly how in theory. In the ancestral records, his father had passed down to him during those underground years. Isaac had discovered a figure from the family's own bloodline. His great-great-grandfather, a man named Isaac Gerta. Zeke had suffered the same violent, uncontrollable mana constitution. And yet somehow Zeke had not only survived it, he had ascended to the 10th class of magic, a level no other human being had ever reached. After years of painstaking study, Isaac had reverse-engineered how. The answer was a specific type of runestone, one that deliberately damages the mana pathways, forcing the body to open new routes under continuous pressure, dispersing the violent mana shock before it could build into an explosion. The catch was brutal, the success rate was almost nothing. Isaac had barely pulled it off moments before dying, but that small flame in his palm before death had been the proof. Now, with young hands that didn't shake and a mind carrying decades of expertise, he sat down and carved the runestone from scratch. Then he reached out his palm and cast a fireball, expecting something small, cautious, controlled. What came out of him nearly scorched the ceiling. Isaac scrambled back in pure shock, staring at the char marks on the wall. The runestone was still intact. He looked inward, reading the state of his mana pathways, and found not one new pathway, not two but three. Three distinct mana circuits, each with its own size and its own properties, all active simultaneously. He could cast 3 spells at the same time. In a world where most mages struggled to maintain even one, what Isaac was holding in that child's body was something that had no name yet. But he didn't let himself get swept up in the excitement, because 3 pathways weren't enough. As long as the violent mana still flowing, the explosions were still a risk. He needed more pathways, which meant he needed to push himself harder, use magic more frequently, force the body to keep adapting. And until he reached that threshold, no one could be near him. No, not even Hans. But Isaac hadn't even had time to settle into that resolve, before Hans came right back to his room, with a plate of freshly baked bread. Isaac stared at him. Hans stared back with absolute unshakable cheerfulness. Isaac asked him how old he was. 12, Hans said. 12 years old and already impossible to get rid of. Isaac took a single piece of the bread, and the moment the taste hit him, something shifted behind his eyes. The nanny had baked it. He recognized it instantly. He hadn't tasted her bread in over 50 years. He asked Hans where she was, and the answer stopped him cold. Her son Hinder had pneumonia. The whole village of Black Goose had it. Multiple children all sick at the same time. Isaac set the bread down slowly and the memory surfaced. This was the Black Goose Village mass pneumonia incident. In his previous life, it had ended with the nanny losing her son. She had carried that grief for the rest of her days, right up until one of Isaac's mana explosions took her too. He was not going to let that happen again. His next question to Hans was precise and urgent. What kind of monster had recently been subjugated near the nanny's village? Hans described something giant and silver-furred, vaguely spider-shaped. Something the magic tower had reportedly purchased as research material. Isaac identified it immediately, a winter spider. Winter spiders weren't especially dangerous on their own, but they bred at a staggering rate and carried something far worse than venom. A dense, suffocating mana field that acted like poison when inhaled over time. This era hadn't identified mana poisoning yet. Everyone in the village thought the children had a respiratory illness. They were wrong, and without the right treatment, Hinder would die. Isaac packed herbs and vanished into the woods before anyone could stop him. By the time the nanny heard the knock at her door that night, Isaac was barely standing, exhausted from hours of foraging in the dark. He fell into her arms the moment she opened the door. She tried to turn him away. The illness, she said. He might catch it. He tied a strip of cloth across his nose and walked past her into the house. He found Hinder pale and weak in his bed, covered in faint bluish marks, the unmistakable signature of mana poisoning. The boy's first concern, barely able to speak, was for his mother's job. He begged Isaac not to fire her. Isaac patted the boy's forehead and told him he wasn't going anywhere, that Hinder was the only person who ever snuck him wheat bread. So he'd better get well. He gave the nanny precise instructions. Crush the herbs. Brew them twice. Let them cool. Then feed them to every child. But the herbs were temporary. To stop the mana poisoning from coming back, the source had to be destroyed. And that meant going into the winter spider nest, which meant going into the old abandoned mine, at 12 years old, with no combat training. Isaac hired a hunter to guide him to the limestone cave entrance, paid the man, sent him home, and stood at the dark mouth of the mine by himself. Before stepping in, he scanned the area and found exactly what he needed: frost belladonna. The plant's berries were a natural anesthetic in small doses, but to winter spiders they were lethal. He couldn't help noting the brutal irony: the spiders nested in the exact same habitat as the plant that killed them. He gathered as much as he could carry, hands already swelling from the potency of the poison, then descended into the cave. The ladder creaked under him as he climbed down into a massive underground cavern. At the bottom he found human bones scattered among monster remains. Then the rustling started from all directions at once. Isaac didn't hesitate. He conjured a ring of fireballs to surround himself, using the light to find them dozens of silver shapes crouching in the dark, watching him. Fire kept them back for now. He wrapped his face, set the belladonna alight, and let the poisonous smoke roll through the cave in thick clouds. The spiders reacted, twitching, weakening, retreating from the haze. Isaac worked 3 spells simultaneously: fire magic holding the ring of flames, purification keeping the toxins from his own bloodstream, and a phase shift spell managing the rest. He was 12 years old, running 3 active magical systems at once, in a cave full of poison and silver spiders. As the creatures slowed and paralyzed, he moved through them, and finished the survivors with clean bursts of flame. Then he noticed the remaining spiders fleeing toward a cold section of the cave. He followed and immediately regretted leaving his coat behind. The temperature near the water dropped so sharply that ice began forming on the walls, and on the ceiling thousands of spider eggs packed in thick clusters. He looked down, and something massive looked back. The winter spider queen was nothing like the ones he had just burned through. She was enormous, fire-resistant, and exhaled frost instead of breathing air. This was why they were called winter spiders. It all led back to her. Cold sweat ran down Isaac's back as she lunged. He threw himself sideways, hit the ice floor hard, and scrambled to his feet. He berated himself under his breath for always jinxing his own luck. His fireballs did almost nothing. She batted them aside like insects. And his body was running out of time. A 12-year-old frame with no combat training. After a sleepless night and hours of active spellcasting, he was hitting his absolute limit. No one was coming to help him. He stood there in the frozen dark, shaking, and thought about the nanny. How wheat didn't grow anywhere near the north. How every single week, she traveled hours to a distant city just to buy high-quality wheat, so that Isaac could have soft bread. Every week, for years without ever being asked. He reached down and picked up his shovel. If it was just a bug, then he was going to treat it like one. He charged at the queen directly, using her slow movement against her, and drove the shovel into the top of her skull hard enough to crack it. It wasn't enough to kill her. She dragged him underneath her enormous body, and he refused to let go of her leg. Pinned beneath a creature the size of a carriage, Isaac made a decision. He gathered every bit of remaining mana, built a fireball, then compressed it tighter, smaller, hotter, compressing it again until the flame stopped being orange and turned blue. A blue flame dense as small as his fist. He drove it into the underside of the queen's abdomen and released. The blue flame didn't burn her skin, it cooked her from the inside. The queen shuddered and thrashed as life left her body, trapping Isaac's arm in the process. He yanked and pulled and finally tore his arm free. And then his head hit the ice floor, and everything went dark. He came back to consciousness in the nanny's cottage, hearing Hans's voice and the nanny's voice talking somewhere nearby. Apparently he had killed the queen, crawled out of the mine, staggered back to the village, and collapsed in Hans's arms at the entrance before passing out completely. He'd been unconscious for roughly half a day. The first thing he heard when he sat up was the nanny saying, Hinder was completely cured, and the herbs had worked on every child in the village. Hans looked at Isaac the way someone looks at a person they've known their whole life, and still can't quite figure out, saying that was just how Isaac was, that he might have gotten sharp and cold around the edges, but his good heart had never gone anywhere. Isaac nearly combusted from embarrassment, and sat up immediately so they'd know he was awake. When the nanny demanded to know why he'd gone somewhere dangerous alone, he told her calmly that he had fallen while gathering herbs nearby. No 12-year-old had any business claiming to have killed a spider queen, and he wasn't about to try making that case. Before leaving, he told the nanny to take another full week off. Hinder needed time to fully recover, and then before she could protest, he added that she wouldn't be idle. He wanted apple jam made from the basket of apples the villagers had sent as thanks, to eat with wheat bread when she returned. She broke into a smile and promised she'd make apple pie too. 1 week later, Isaac was jogging laps around the estate grounds at dawn. Something had changed inside him. The 3-mana circuits had become 4. The vessel was more stable. The explosive pressure reduced just slightly, and he could now sustain 4 simultaneous spells, where before he could manage 3. He'd figured it out fighting the queen, pushing past his physical limit, had forced his body to adapt faster than research alone ever could. Magic wasn't just mental, it was physical. Mana manipulation required calculation, comprehension, rapid intuition, all of which demanded a body that didn't collapse under the strain. He remembered that in his previous life, his aide Lucas had trained his stamina alongside his magic. He wasn't going to skip that step this time. His daily run was cut short that morning by the head butler, Schiller, a dry, formal, emotionally armored man who had always kept everyone at careful distance. He appeared to summon Isaac for a checkup with the territory's most distinguished personal physician. The doctor examined him, declared him fine, and then reached into his bag and produced something unexpected. 6 bowls of a potion called panacea. Panacea meant cure-all in the common tongue. It was used by soldiers and high-level mages as a stimulant, a mana flow stabilizer. Except and this was the part that only Isaac knew. The translation was wrong. Whoever had translated the ancient language name had gotten the effect backwards. Panacea didn't stabilize mana flow, it amplified it. For anyone with a normal constitution, that was a useful enhancement. For Isaac, it would normally be catastrophic, accelerating the very force trying to destroy him. But in his current situation, with 4 mana circuits already carved open, he recognized it for what it actually was, a catalyst. Used correctly, it could accelerate the opening of new pathways. His father had gone to extreme lengths to acquire these 6 bottles. Isaac wasn't going to waste them. After the doctor left, Schiller lingered with something on his mind. He mentioned carefully that he had heard about the Black Goose Village incident, that Isaac had apparently cured a village full of sick children. Isaac could tell from his tone that Hans had been quietly interrogated. Schiller warned him that the advisory committee would raise questions if this got out, told him to restrain himself, or at minimum to inform Schiller first before acting. It was the closest thing to approval that Chisser was physically capable of giving. And in that moment, Isaac remembered something Jonas had told him before dying, that Schiller had served House Gerta until the very end, losing his own life in the process. The cold, unbending head butler was underneath the armor, someone who cared more deeply than he'd ever admit. Isaac smiled at him and said he understood. It was the beginning of something neither of them would acknowledge out loud. But quiet trouble was already moving through the estate before Isaac had time to breathe. A maid named Rosa came to Schiller's office one evening with alarming news. 2 young women on the staff had disappeared. Clara and Annette were simply gone, with no explanation and no farewell. Annette in particular stood out. She hadn't taken a single day off in 3 years, was working to pay for her sick father's medicine, and had no reason to vanish. The staff began whispering and speculating, as servants do. A man named Bill, a former bandit who had been taken in and given a second chance, had a theory. He told the other maids that the family kept a mage in bad condition, and that maybe the master of the house was using whatever dark resources he could find to try to heal his son, and that the missing girls might have been sacrificed. What Bill didn't know was that Isaac was standing directly behind him. Isaac smiled and told Bill he had a very interesting story and asked to hear more. Bill went pale and nearly collapsed on the spot. Isaac took him to his office, sat him down and listened carefully as Bill laid out what he actually knew. 3 maids had disappeared over the past 2 months, one after another. Hilda first, then Clara, then Annette, last seen heading to Mass on a Sunday. Isaac fixed Bill with a cold stare and asked him directly whether Bill thought he, Isaac, was behind the disappearances. Bill, sweating through his shirt, admitted that was the general assumption. He rambled nervously, mentioning Hans, saying that Hans was closest to Isaac, always bruised, always complaining, probably due for the most painful death of all. The moment those words landed, Isaac's expression went somewhere very still. Bill realized what he'd said and immediately began begging for his life. Isaac let the moment sit before calmly asking whether Bill wanted to live. Bill said yes, desperately. Isaac told him that living would require some work. In the quiet of that exchange, a memory surfaced: 2 specific maids from Isaac's first life. After the nanny was gone, Rosa and Annette had been the only 2 who had chosen to keep serving him. He'd tried to push them away, they'd refused to go. He'd told Annette once to stop bringing him potions, that there was no hope left. She had stepped up to him and said quietly, without flinching, that she understood what it meant to cause someone's death with your own hands. That it could happen to anyone, even once, even when you never meant it. That you could either suffocate under the weight of that guilt or choose to live anyway. She had spoken from experience. She had lost Clara once before, believed she could have saved her. That was what Annette had carried in silence while taking care of a boy who pushed everyone away. Isaac had never asked for more details in that life. This time he was going to make sure Annette never had to carry that guilt at all. Bill came back to him. Quickly turns out gathering underground information was one of his actual skills. He had spent Isaac's money talking to beggars near the roads who had seen things. The conclusion: the missing maids had been taken by slave traders. The traders operated by Promise Passage South, where life was supposedly better, and the roads going south were dangerous enough that hiring escorts seemed reasonable. The women had gone willingly, trusting people who had no intention of taking them anywhere safe. Isaac didn't linger on the moral calculus. He told Bill to lead him to the broker. What Bill hadn't counted on was Isaac being several steps ahead of him the entire time, because Bill, deep in his head, had already decided Isaac was a naive child with money, a golden goose, an easy mark. He was already mentally spending a future of easy payments, extracted from a kid who didn't know how the world worked. He thought the only flaw in his plan was that Isaac was a bit of a walking time bomb. He told himself the reward was worth the risk. He was wrong about almost everything he had assumed about Isaac Gerta. When Bill opened his eyes next, he was sitting in a cell, wearing only his underwear. He screamed. Behind him, Isaac stood perfectly still with a runestone in his hand and an expression of complete calm. Bill frantically pieced together what had happened. He had sneaked Isaac out of the estate. They had gone to meet the broker, and then the broker had spotted the jewel on Isaac's chest and correctly identified him as a noble's child, a target far more valuable than a scout. They'd both been taken and thrown in separate cells. But here was the strangest part. Everything had been stripped from Bill, but Isaac still had everything he'd walked in with. Bill realized in a cold flash that this was intentional. He screamed at Isaac, demanding to know how they were going to get out. Isaac looked at him, told him he was leaving to find Annette, and then stretched out one hand and dissolved the iron cage with a pulse of magic. Bill stood there staring at the empty space where bars had been moments before. His entire attitude rearranged itself in about 3 seconds. He hit the floor and begged not to be left behind, swearing he would do anything Isaac wanted. Isaac remembered a different version of this, the version where Bill was caught selling the family's secrets to a criminal organization, where he begged on his knees in the snow and no one listened, and where his blood soaked into the frozen ground. In that life, Bill was cut down because he was caught too late and trusted too little. But Isaac had already realized something important. Bill wasn't just a liability, he was a resource, a former bandit who knew the underground economy, who had contacts nobody in the nobility could reach, and who was currently face down on the floor promising to do anything. Isaac pulled out a contract scroll. He explained the 3 conditions clearly. 1. Bill would obey Isaac without conditions. 2. Bill would never disclose information about Isaac. 3. Violation of either term would result in death. Bill shrieked. He told Isaac there was absolutely no way he was signing something like that. Then they heard Boots bandits moving toward their location through the underground corridors. Isaac didn't even turn his head. He simply mentioned that they didn't have much time. Bill grabbed the knife from Isaac's hand, cut his finger, and pressed it to the scroll. The contract lit up with a bright pulse. The moment the bandits came through the door, Isaac hit them with ice, not fire. 3 precise ice strikes that knocked all 3 of them out cold. Bill stared at the unconscious bodies, then back at Isaac, then at the corridor. Isaac explained that ice magic was rare precisely because it was impractical in combat. It required managing 4 stages simultaneously: shaping it, compressing it, condensing, and evaporating. Each individually simple, all at once nearly impossible. But it had one advantage that made it perfect down here. It left no evidence. Ice turned to water. Blunt force trauma looked like blunt force trauma, and very few people knew enough about ice magic to recognize it. He also mentioned casually that the frost mana stone came from the Winter Spider Queen's carcass. Even the dead queen was still providing resources. As they moved through the sewers, Isaac made something else clear. He wasn't here to kill every bandit in the building. The organization would just refill with new ones if he wiped out the current batch. What he needed was control, not destruction. His real target was one specific person. They found him before Isaac even had to go looking. The boss of the organization was a man named Nears, the kind of unhinged that made even his own subordinates stare at the floor, rather than look directly at him. He bathed in blood. He held conversations with his dead father's skeleton at the dinner table. He believed black magic could resurrect the dead, and he was enormous. When Isaac hurled a large ice spear directly at the man's chest, Nears sidestepped it and shattered it against the wall with his bare hands. Bill screamed. Isaac observed calmly that Nears had to be of northern tribal descent. Given that level of physical power, Nears announced that a mage's blood would make excellent material for his black magic experiments. Bill began bargaining for his life in real time loudly, and then Nears stopped moving. Bill opened his eyes and saw the original ice spear protruding from Nears's back, the one that had been deflected off the wall earlier. Isaac had redirected it. While Nears was focused on the threat in front of him, the ice had come from behind. Nears hit the floor, and Isaac told Bill, very simply, that from that moment forward, Bill was the new leader of the organization. Bill looked at the knife in his hand, at the body on the floor, at Isaac's calm face. He understood what was being asked. He did what was necessary. The maids were found in the sewers beneath the complex, and loaded into a carriage back to the estate. Hilda Clara, all alive, but not unscathed when Annette finally came to Isaac's office to speak with him. She described what she had found when she reached Hilda and Clara underground. Both of them had lost their minds in the dark. A few more days and Annette might have followed them into that place. She admitted something hard bar, still there. Had been a moment where she could have escaped. The iron gate on her cell was broken. She had stayed, because leaving the others wasn't something she was able to do. And then she said something that stopped Isaac cold. That she had feared, near the end, that she might have killed Clara with her own hands, if they hadn't been rescued. Isaac thanked her for telling him, and let the weight of it settle. He didn't push further, not yet. But he had seen something in her mana pool during the conversation. Something that most people would have walked right past, without noticing. Annette had real power in her. Impressive, structured, latent, the kind of potential that deserved cultivation. He filed that away. Meanwhile, back in the shadows, Bill was holding his first meeting with Nears's sleeper agents, the ones planted inside the mansion itself, hiding among the regular staff. Isaac had predicted this. His logic was simple. You couldn't eliminate criminal organizations from a region by killing the current batch. You had to own the next one before it formed. Bill was beginning to understand that Isaac had been orchestrating this from the very first moment, and that the contract he'd signed wasn't a threat, it was a leash. Then the agents revealed something unexpected to Bill. Nears had been paying tribute regularly, on a schedule, to a pair of knights who had been looking the other way in exchange for the payments. 2 knights with military authority and access to the border fortress. 2 knights who were supposed to be protecting the people of the north. Before Bill could even process that fully, Isaac's father returned to the estate. He came back from the border fortress winterband with a story. An infantryman in Burn City had attacked his own company commander. Isaac heard Burn City and immediately recognized the name. That was where the underground operation had been active, and the detail that caught his attention wasn't the attack itself. It was that the victim, the company commander, had asked for a tribunal instead of summary punishment. Why would a victim fight to protect a process that might let his attacker walk away? 2 knights entered the room, fickle, red-haired and impatient, and Randolph, brown-haired, quiet, with a bandage wrapped around his head. Isaac's father invited them in and dismissed Isaac. But not before Isaac heard Fickle pushing for a fast execution, and Randolph saying only that he was following orders. Fickle expressed surprise that Randolph could be so casual considering he was the one who had lost an ear. Randolph was the victim. Randolph was the company commander. The person who had cut off Randolph's ears was the attacker demanding a tribunal. That information was still clicking into place when Bill came sprinting toward Isaac in the hall, completely panicked, telling him it was a matter of life and death. Bill had received a message through one of Nears's old contacts. A corpse had appeared near the underground entrance, every finger severed except the left pinky. And that morning, Bill had woken to find all the missing fingers arranged on his pillow. A message: pay the tribute within 2 days or lose your own fingers next. Isaac barely reacted. He asked Bill if there had been any witnesses to the killing. One, and they'd described a sword that moved like a flash of light, and an attacker with a bandage wrapped around their head. Isaac turned and walked away, telling Bill he already had what he needed. He was going to the dungeon. The prisoner they were holding, the man who had attacked Randolph and lost him an ear, was someone Isaac needed to speak with directly. The man sat in chains and stared at Isaac without saying a word. Isaac studied his face and recognized him. Not from this life. From a book. In his first life, decades into isolation, Isaac had read a volume called The Chronicles of Villains, a compilation of famous criminals and rebels, illustrated with portraits. This man's face was one of them. Isaac called him by his true name, Kyle. The prisoner, who had been calling himself Carlson, physically stepped backward in his chains. He demanded to know how Isaac knew that name, and Isaac kept going. He mentioned that he also knew Kyle was the illegitimate son of Kashan, that he had disappeared from record over a decade ago, that the Chronicles had assessed him as a future candidate for the continent's 7th swordsmaster. Kyle was shaking now. In the timeline Isaac had lived through, this man had escaped execution and led a rebel army. A war of succession gone wrong had driven a prince to side with the empire, triggering a civil war that tore the kingdom apart, and Kyle had become the face of the resistance against imperial occupation. A future swordsmaster, a future rebel leader, currently sitting in chains in a basement. Isaac told him to calm down and asked why Knights of Winterband had gotten involved in slave trading. Kyle stared at him for a long moment and then decided Isaac was worth answering. He was the eldest son of House Gerta after all. But Isaac recognized quickly that he couldn't fully manipulate Kyle. The man was too clear-eyed, Too principled, too aware of his own situation, so Isaac shifted approach. He decided to draw the corrupt knights out himself. Through Bill, an invitation was sent to Fickle and Randolph from the supposed New Year's leadership. A meeting in the underground, a tribute negotiation. The two knights came through the sewers dressed in hooded cloaks, already suspicious when they found no slaves and no familiar faces. Bill, trembling internally but maintaining a surface of authority, welcomed them in. The room was dark. A figure sat at the far end of the table. Fickle threw his weight around, immediately talked about how bold the new leader must be to invite them after failing the tribute. Then the figure spoke. A child's voice cut through the dark. Both men went rigid. Isaac stepped into the lamplight, and Randolph dropped to his knees instantly. He recognized who he was looking at. Randolph yelled at Fickle to kneel. Isaac asked them one question: why? The story they told was not the one he expected. The troops at Winterband were underfed, undersupplied, operating with equipment so deteriorated that soldiers were dying from preventable causes, not from battles but from shortages. Fickle and Randolph had started taking bribes from Nears because the money covered the gaps, replacing rusted swords, feeding men who would otherwise go hungry in the northern cold. They hadn't planned for it to become what it became. That was when Kyle had walked in on one of their payments and confronted them, and they had responded by trying to silence him. Kyle had beaten both of them, taken Randolph's ear, and let himself be arrested, leaving Randolph with the words, "Open your ears to the truth." Isaac heard all of it. Then he delivered his verdict: death. Fickle erupted. He screamed that Isaac couldn't understand what they were going through. The cold, the shortages, the impossible standards set by an upright lord who lacked flexibility, and that after everything they had sacrificed, this was the answer they got. Isaac agreed that he didn't know what they had gone through in the snow. Then he asked very quietly why they had also kidnapped civilians. Fickle claimed that was entirely Nears's operation. Isaac asked whether that meant Fickle believed he hadn't crossed the same line. Fickle lost control. He declared that Isaac couldn't understand, that protecting Gerta was all that mattered, and if cutting Isaac down would let them survive and continue that protection, then he was ready to do it. He unleashed his aura, the visible physical manifestation of a soldier at the edge of his power, and Randolph stood up. He drew his sword but not toward Isaac. He stepped between Fickle and the boy, at the other end of the room. He reminded Fickle of what Kyle had told them, that a sword without will is a tool, but a sword that gains a will of its own becomes something monstrous, that a masterpiece weapon, the moment it decides it's what it wants to cut, is no longer a masterpiece. Fickle couldn't believe Randolph had turned on him. Randolph told him he didn't care what happened, after it was their karma. He also made one more thing clear: not all of the tribute money had gone to the troops. Some of it had found its own way into different pockets. That was the truth Fickle hadn't wanted spoken out loud. Fickle wavered just enough. Randolph finished him. When the dust settled, Randolph stood alone before Isaac, head bowed, waiting for whatever came next. He explained that when Kyle had walked in on them, they had tried to silence him, and Kyle had beaten both of them and let himself be captured on purpose, telling Randolph to open his ears to the truth before disappearing into a cell. Randolph had stopped the execution order because of guilt. He knew it. He said it. And then he asked Isaac quietly, voice no longer steady, what would happen to his family when this became known. Isaac told him that he already knew the answer himself. Then Isaac let a pause sit in the air between them, long enough that Bill, in the corner quietly disposing of the evening's evidence, started to sweat. And then Isaac asked Randolph if he would like the chance to pay for his sins through other means. In that moment something shifted in the room, the weight of a verdict becoming an offer. Randolph had expected execution. He had walked into that meeting fully expecting to die. What Isaac was handing him instead was a second chance tied to service. The same kind of deal Isaac had offered Bill, but without the contract scroll. Because unlike Bill, Randolph didn't need a magical binding to keep him honest. He was already carrying his guilt like a stone around his neck. That Isaac had understood for a long time was the most reliable kind of loyalty. As for Kyle, the man who had started all of this by walking in on two nights taking dirty money, and deciding that silence wasn't something he was capable of, Isaac had not forgotten about him either. Kyle was sitting in a dungeon cell waiting for a military tribunal that was being pushed toward a fast execution by the very people he had tried to expose. A future swordsmaster. A future rebel leader, currently in chains because he had done the right thing. Isaac wasn't going to let that play out the way it had before. The pieces of what Isaac was building were becoming visible now. Not a single dramatic confrontation but a network, a criminal organization converted into an intelligence arm, a former bandit turned field operative with a binding contract and genuine fear as motivation, a disgraced knight with everything to prove and nothing left to lose, and a principled soldier who had done more with a single missing ear than most people managed with their whole careers. Meanwhile, Isaac's own mana circuits had increased again from 4 to 5, the result of killing Nears, pushing his body past another threshold. He returned to his training not satisfied. He was practicing layered combat, now hiding an ice crystal behind a fireball, using the fireball as the distraction while the ice delivered the real strike. He knew he had gotten lucky against Niers. The man had underestimated him and dropped his guard for one moment, and that was the only reason Isaac was still alive. Jonas, in the conversation before he died, had told Isaac something important, that the enemies House Gerta had made over the decades were specifically optimized to counter mages. They had studied how to neutralize people like Isaac. There wasn't going to be another lucky gap, which meant Isaac had to become strong enough that luck wasn't the variable anymore. He thought about the world he had come back to, the war that had eventually torn it apart, the gate that opened between worlds, the things that had poured through. The version of him that had died at 71 had never been able to fight any of it. He had spent his entire life locked in a room, trying to fix a body that couldn't even stand next to someone he loved. And in the end, his solution came too late for every single person it could have protected. But he was 12 years old now. He had 5 mana circuits, 4 pathways more than he'd had at death, and the memory of everyone he had failed burned in him like its own kind of fuel. Hans was alive. The nanny was alive. Jonas had both arms. Hinder had recovered. Clara and Annette and Hilda were back at the estate and breathing. And for the first time in over half a century, Isaac Gerta had people around him. Not because he couldn't keep them away, but because he was quietly, methodically, carefully building a world where being near him wasn't a death sentence. He still had a long way to go. The mana explosions weren't fully contained yet. The corrupt structures feeding off his family's territory were barely scratched. Kyle was still in a cell, and somewhere beyond the northern border, the things that had eventually destroyed his first life were still forming. But for the first time since he woke up in this body, Isaac allowed himself to recognize what he had already accomplished, not as victories but as proof that the math had changed. In his first life, every choice he made was reactive, a response to disasters already unfolding. In this one, he was already 3 moves ahead of every disaster he could see coming. He jogged another lap around the estate at dawn, breath clouding in the cold northern air. The frost belladonna had been the spider's weakness hiding in plain sight. The panacea had been mislabeled poison that was secretly the right catalyst. Bill had been a liability who became an asset. Randolph had been a corrupt knight who became maybe something redeemable. Everything Isaac had lived through in his first life had looked like nothing but loss, and he had spent 60 years in the dark turning that loss into understanding. Now he carried that understanding in a young body, with decades still in front of him. The old man who had died alone in a basement with a single small flame in his palm. He had not failed. He had just arrived late. Isaac kept running. The estate's torches burned low behind him as dawn crept over the frozen north, the kind of light that made the snow look almost warm. He had a lot to do today. He had a contract to review, a prisoner to figure out what to do with, a former knight to put to use, and somewhere in the back of his mind, the question of how to teach a maid with a remarkable mana pool to do something with it. Not because he needed the help, though he did, but because the version of Isaac, who had died, believed that the people around him were nothing but targets. And that version had been catastrophically wrong. The nanny traveled hours every week for wheat flour. Hans had followed him into danger without hesitation and offered comfort through a closed door. Annette had stayed in a broken cage, rather than leave her friends behind. Randolph had turned his sword on his partner to protect a boy he barely knew. Kyle had let himself be arrested to deliver a message about the truth. Every person Isaac had written off as someone he needed to protect by keeping away. It turned out they were also trying to protect him. He hadn't been a cursed child surrounded by fragile people. He had been a child surrounded by people who were, in their own specific ways, extraordinarily strong. And he had spent a lifetime unable to see it. He could see it now. That was the real thing he had brought back from 60 years in the dark. Not the runestone technique, not the mana circuits, not the knowledge of what was coming, but the understanding that none of it mattered if he faced it alone. The world he was building wasn't just a stronger version of House Gerta. It was a world where the people who deserved to make it to the end actually would. Isaac Gerta had died with regret in his heart and a single small flame in his hand. He had come back with fire in his blood, and the names of everyone he intended to save burned into memory. This time, he was going to make sure the flame arrived before the regret did.